So the person that I interviewed for this assignment was actually my mom. She was in the city working 2 miles north of the World Trade Center when 9/11 happened. She was 8 months pregnant with her first child, me. So that made it especially emotional for her. And so it was that combined with the fact that she'd had a really disturbing dream the night before. It was about a forest fire where there were animals that were stuck in the trees and they couldn't escape, and they were burning and screeching and they were jumping down. She said in hindsight that was definitely sort of like almost like a vision of what happened, which is pretty crazy. So as she and my aunt were walking down Broadway into the city for work, they saw the first plane fly over, and my mom said that everyone just kind of stopped and looked up because they were all realizing that you never really see planes in New York City, and so because planes don't fly in New York City, but nobody had really ever thought about it until then. And 6 minutes later, it hit the first tower. 6 minutes after they saw it. So their office was fairly close. My mom's office, and she could see from the windows the smoke from the towers. It was like 2 miles away or thereabouts. And when it first happened, she told all of her employees to go home because, like, before everyone else in New York had the same idea. She worked in an advertising agency, so there were the whole room was just filled with TV monitors, and so they were all turned to the news for that day because of what was going on. So that really meant that there was no way you could forget about what was going on. And my mom, because she was pregnant, decided not to try to get out of the city with all the crowds and with the potentially bad air. And it was bad, as we found out later on. But she stayed where she was because she thought that would be safer, and then my aunt came and joined her. So they waited there together and just watched the smoke rise up. And she said you could see the plume of smoke that went up when the first tower fell. So they couldn't leave because the Long Island Railroad had stopped running and she couldn't get back to Long Island. So it's actually really weird because my mom had been working in Kansas City for 3 years and then returned just about a year before this happened. So it's pretty crazy. She felt really alone because it took a lot of time to reach her family. Like she couldn't reach my dad until much later in the day. And her sister came back to wait with her, and so the whole day she said kind of felt like a lull, which is a really weird way to describe it, she says, but it's because it's like there was nothing you could do. They were just waiting. It was almost like waiting for the other shoe to drop because New York City is full of potential targets once you start seeing it that way. She kind of realized that it had been done on purpose, even though some of her colleagues were expressing other theories, because there was no way that two planes would hit the two towers. So she was wondering what kind of world I would be born into. So she finally got to leave work at 5 p.m. because the LIRR started running trains to get the people who were still in the city out. And the streets were empty, and my mom says she remembers walking down Broadway with my aunt, and there was the only person there was just one photographer with a tripod, and he was facing away from them and pointing back at where the smoke was still rising downtown. So that when she told me that just really impacted me because it's just so vivid, just even though I was there, but I didn't see it. So she held it together until that night, and finally she says she remembers laying awake in bed, and then just the tears started leaking down her face because she'd been holding it together all day, and then as soon as she got home, she just and was safe. She was just it was just sort of a release of all the stress from the day because she just kind of held it together to survive the whole thing. She went back to work 3 days later, and she said it was really weird because everyone was trying to act like things were normal, but obviously they weren't. So, and there were also posters taped everywhere of people's missing relatives and friends. So, and then I was born 6 weeks later, and my parents named me Olivia because of the olive branch symbolizing peace. They'd actually been thinking about that name before, but that gave it a new significance. This event. So my mom went back to work after I was born, and her company moved uptown across from St. Patrick's Cathedral, and she thought that that might be a target for terrorists because the attacks were at least partly religiously motivated. And after a year, she quit to stay home with me because the whole ordeal sort of made her realize how important family is, and she hadn't expected that she would feel so strongly that she wanted to stay home with me, but she realized that it was the right thing for her. So, yeah. And then, so every 9/11, every year on that day, my mom cried, just quietly again, sort of like she did that first night, and she also says that she talks with her sister every year about the day, like, on 9/11 every year. And so her having that reaction is, like, really remarkable and just shows how big of an impact that it had, because my mom is not an anxious person. Like, things don't usually ruffle her. So hearing her talk about actually crying about the whole thing really changes it from my perspective. We were very fortunate that my mom was able to get out, like, relative, like, unscathed except emotionally. Two of our cousins worked in the World Trade Center buildings and were there that day. One of them walked in late but decided to go back out and get a cup of coffee because he was already late, so he thought that would be a good idea. And then the plane hit. And then the other cousin was actually worked on the floor above where the plane hit, but walked down right away before the stairs started melting. Like, he walked down and got out. And that cousin had also been in the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. So he decided after that to not work in New York City anymore because he felt like he'd tempted fate once or twice too many times. Yeah, so he and his wife moved to Connecticut after that, and now they live down in North Carolina, so that's even further away. So my mom said the biggest long-term impact for her was the fact that now when she looks at a plane, it's not just a plane, it's a weapon. And when she looked at a building, it was a potential target, and people were potential terrorists. She says that she doesn't assign that specifically to any one group of people. It's just that she thinks now, like, anybody could be, like, plotting to kill a bunch of people, which is really scary. And I think before that, it was the biggest takeaway was also just a loss of innocence, because before that she kind of just thought that the world would continue to spin on and just do what it had done before 9/11.